Welcome to Bookish, a casual book club. It's me, Kofi,
Hi, it's Laura.
And Sylvia.
and today we're going to be talking about audiobooks and how it enhances our reading and listening and understanding of various kinds of text. I sort of pitched this topic because I was at a conference and it made me think about how listening to narration um, enhances my reading of a book or even my appreciation of the written word even more so because it almost is kind of like transcendental is the word I used, which seems very fanciful and spiritual, but it's more like it sort of lifts me out of wherever I am. So if I'm in the car and I'm driving, or even if I'm in the house and I have my earbuds and I'm listening, it really so much depends on the narrator and his or her voice and how they use inflection, intonation, all these things that happen even when we're reading, but we're not always cognizant of. So that's where we want to start. And I know, Laura, you listen to a lot of audiobooks, especially fiction. So, in your listening, what happens when you're listening to audiobooks that differs than when you're actually reading the same kind of book? I guess that would be the opening question.
So I actually started listening to audiobooks exclusively nonfiction. And I think it started with my habit of listening to podcasts, lots of podcasts, and they're all nonfiction. So then I started listening to the nonfiction books. And for a long time, I actually had a hard time listening to fictional work. um, I had hard time following the story for some reason. Whereas like fictional work, nonfiction work, it was easier to follow the explanation of concepts and ideas that were abstract or informational. But something about sort of creative storytelling, I had hard time following it. And I do think it's one of those things you train your ears and your brain to get better at because now I really feel like I've don't have a whole lot of time to just sit and read. So I have been listening to fiction on audiobooks now. And I'm much better at it. I can follow it. I just can't, I have to stop turning it on when I go to bed because then like 17 chapters will go by after I fall asleep, which is not good. So yeah, it's great. So I can listen to audiobooks when I'm cleaning the house or cooking or when I'm driving the kids around. Sometimes when I'm waiting for my kids at, sports or a piano lesson or something. So I really like that it can just go with me wherever I need to go. And it actually helps drown out outside noise, with the earbuds. Whereas reading, I need to be quiet, right? I need there to be quiet in order to read. So there are those advantages that are different from reading, I think. Yeah.
Same question to you, Sylvia.
So I think to Laura's point, so I was looking up some of the statistics for audiobooks, and the Audio Publishers Association mentioned that about 55% of audiobook readers, and that number, and that's of the population who reads audiobooks, which is a growing population, and I think it's forecasted for like double-digit growth. So a lot of people are reading more and more audiobooks. But of those people who are reading them, they said that 55% of them listen to audiobooks at home, and 30% or so listen to them in the car or on a commute. And so I was kind of surprised by that because I figured more people would listen to audiobooks while they're commuting, right? Especially if they have long commutes. And that's how I started listening to audiobooks. I used to have a 45-minute commute to work, and it was a really good time just to kind of start reading a story, and I would have I'm a captive audience in the car. But then the 55% at home made me wonder, what are people doing? And if they broke this data set down by gender, I would wager that there would be more women than men, perhaps, listening to audiobooks for whatever reason, and doing different tasks, right? So working around the house, or, I don't know, just cooking and doing, I listen to them a lot when I do laundry.
Mhm.
And, for the same reasons as Laura's, I just didn't have the time to like sit still when that time could be used like doing other things I have to do. So yeah, that's how I started reading it. And then I read both nonfiction and fiction. Laura, I think like my theory for why fiction is a little bit more trickier to follow than nonfiction is that nonfiction, I feel like I could pop in and out of like if I'm distracted for a moment, and I feel like I can still get the gist of what's happening. Whereas with fiction, especially if it's a longer work, the plot can get like really complicated. And
Mhm.
if I'm missing something, I'm like, wait, who is this character? Why did they do that? Wait, how did we end up in this like back alleyway? What's going on? At any given point, I don't know whether a scene is really, really important or not. And
Mhm.
I get lost much more quickly in that plot structure because it is structure. Whereas a lot of nonfiction, there is a structure, but I feel like the way that it is that people tell their life stories or about a situation, you can kind of like put it together a little bit. So
Mhm.
yeah,
Mhm.
that's how I kind of got to reading it. And the last audiobook I read, fiction, was the last one we talked about, the Magician by Colin
Mhm.
Tobin, who that was a big novel, and there's no
Mhm.
way I could have finished that just like sitting down and reading. I had to listen to it, but I had to really pay attention and like, not read it again in bed, and not listen to it in bed, because then I would fall asleep. Well, laundry. I got so much laundry done because I was listening to that thing while I was like washing and folding laundry and doing things like that. Things I don't even
I
have.
have I have a good example about missing a plot point. The one of the last
Mhm.
ones I listened to was it's called we're all beside ourselves or something like that. And before reading it, I was told there is a twist, right? Something happens. No one told me what it was. You're not supposed to know. And then so I'm listening, and then all of a sudden I was like, what? What happened? And I realized I was not paying attention during this like
Mhm.
brief mention of whatever the plot twist was. And then so I realized like chapters later that I missed something. So then I had to go back, way back,
Mhm.
to try to
Mhm.
catch it. And then I was like, oh, I see. So that I do have to, and I think you're right, Sylvia. It's because you can miss those details that can make a really big difference in how the plot develops in some novels. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's actually leads to the next question about, is it reading? And I think I would say it's a
Mhm.
different kind of reading. It requires an attention to, not just a voice, but an attention to your ability to imagine as the voice is going. And it's a voice that's disembodied from you, yet somehow embodied because you're paying attention, unless you're not paying attention and then you're like missing something, you have to go back. Almost like if you're reading along or you're reading a book and you could kind of see the words and you're turning the page, see the words, turn the page, and then something will happen on a page and you go, wait, whoa, I missed something, and you turn back. So it's similar in that fashion, because you're attending to it and it becomes almost like embodied in a way that reading does. Especially when you're, at least for me, when I'm in the car, as you said, Sylvia, it's like a captive audience. So, I'm definitely listening. Even if I'm focusing on the road, also focusing on the voice and the story, or whatever the action is in the story, or if it's nonfiction, whatever the ideals that are being built upon. I think there's some value to audiobooks that oftentimes I think in academia are seen,
Mhm.
or viewed negatively, because it doesn't seem like reading in terms of using your eyes to scan and make sense of words or make sense of symbols. Um, and I just wondered, where do you fall on that side? Do you think it's similar to reading? Would you ever assign an audiobook to class or to students and have them go through the same kind of process of note taking and those type of things, but focusing mostly on their listening aspect? Or is that too much?
No, that's a great question. Is it reading? Because, all right, I would contend that it is not the same. It's same different, I guess, is how I would classify it. I do not read my own like research or scholarly research. I don't read that via listening. Because I know for myself, I retain, and I think there's research to support this for like traditional like reading skills, but I retain information much better when I'm reading something in a physical copy, right? So like even though I might be able to recall certain moments from The Magician, for example, I might not be able to quote from specific turns of phrases the way I could from, another book that I have read in person. When I read something like as like a physical copy, I can retain the words a little bit better than when I listen to it. And that's just been me for everything. Having said that, I think that reading via audiobook is a type of reading, and it's a one that I think has to do with access, right? Because not everybody can see the words on the page. And so the thing that it does brain is very important, the way that it activates your brain. And I think if it's doing that and it's kind of leading you to similar critical, thinking skills, imagination, creativity, I think then it has done its purpose, regardless of the modality that you're reading it in. But for me, I know that, taking notes, I have to do that on like a physical copy, or even if it's like physical but digital, like even that's helpful than just listening to it, which is very difficult for me to retain information that way.
I agree. I think I don't remember details. I'll remember like, I call them nuggets, maybe a short phrase or something that was interestingly put or something, but I do have hard time recalling based on listening. But I kind of liken it to maybe like I hear Frank, my husband will listen to like sports on the radio, and like we'll be in the car together, and they're, whoever the announcer is describing what's happening. And I can hear the words, but I have zero idea what they're saying, let alone imagine it. And again, going back to that idea of, I guess, training your ears. So maybe if I listen to it more, I could understand that better. But it just seems like almost a different, the medium almost makes it a different language almost. But I've also noticed that with my own kids, they listen to podcasts and they remember a lot from these podcasts, and out of the blue they'll like, hey mommy, did you know, and like pull out a random fact. So again, I think it's because since they were little, they've been listening to podcasts, and they're trained, their ears are trained to do that. So I wonder, as audiobooks become more prevalent, more, I don't know, accepted even as a form of reading, that more of us will, I don't know, like develop different skills to retain information, or, use audiobooks in different ways than we have been using it. You know what I mean? So for example, like if you go to, databases, and they have some functions where they will read the article to you, right? And I mean, the text is there too, but I know a lot of students use that, and I don't know if they're reading along while they're listening. So there's that difference too. But I do think it definitely is a way of developing your listening skills. I don't know how that affects your reading skills, but yeah.
I think also it develops your imagination, because you do attend a lot of readings. I know, because I've attended them with you. And at literary readings, it's kind of similar. I've always thought it was very similar to listening. Like I grew up listening to baseball on the radio with my dad, like in the car when we were driving to places, and the game would be on. And at first, I was kind of like you, like I would tune out, like I don't understand. But then I realized I began to envision it, like in my head. the pitcher would look like going up to the mound, and then I just could, and then he hits a double, and I could see that happening, like someone rounding the base, and then I began to realize, oh, okay, like I get it. In the same way that when I started attending poetry readings, the first one I was like, I don't understand, I'm tuning out. But then it began to be clear to things. But then at the same time, I also realized that who's reading it makes a big difference. And just like for baseball, like games, the announcers make a big difference. And in some places, the announcer is famous. Like, I can't remember the Chicago Cubs guy. Yeah. So like that makes a big difference too. And I think with audiobooks, sometimes I'll make my choice based off of who I know is reading it. Like I started Will Smith's autobiography before the slap. And then he the slap heard around the world, and then he was narrating it, and it was just like watching Will Smith. It was the same type of charisma that you would expect from him. Went into that book, and I never finished it because then the slap happened, and I just couldn't go back to it. All I could like envision was like that, but just kind of ruined it because. But it did. So I think whoever's reading the audiobook, it makes a big difference. And I'm wondering for you guys, like Kofi, have you ever read an audio or listened to an audiobook where just the reader, the reader, it just kind of is not doing it for you? Because I find that sometimes I actually prefer when the author themselves don't read the book and it's somebody else, because I've been to some readings in person where I really like the book, but then as soon as the author reads the book, I'm like, nope, not doing it. And I think maybe it's how I get my voice, but wondering for you guys if that has made a difference.
It does make a difference for me. Like, I don't know if it's the authors per se that are doing the reading. One book that I read was How to Write a Novel by a guy named Nathan Bransford. And he has a really energetic voice. And so when I would drive in, especially if I was coming in early, listening to his voice kind of kept me a little bit upbeat. And it wasn't that he was saying something very novel or no pun intended, or something new, but I just liked the way he was reading his own book. And when I would go home, I would listen and follow along as he was reading. And it was a different kind of sensation. It's kind of like, and I can only equate it to being a child, having someone teach you to read and you're like listening and following along with them. And I think that there's something still primal, I guess, in that experience that I still like. But at the same time, if I'm at an event and someone's reading their paper, I'm immediately rolling my eyes and like, oh God, do you have any visual? Do you have anything that's going to keep my mind from wandering?
Did that happen recently, Kofi? I get the sense that happened recently.
But I think that I do think that there is something within your brain that happens if you're listening and following along as this reading is going, that is totally different. You're just listening and sort of getting absorbed into the narration. But yeah, it really does matter, the reading voice, and that how that person hits his or her mark, which is probably why actors are better at reading writers' works than writers are reading their own work, in my humble opinion.
Yes.
I had one of some of the first few audiobooks I listened to were all memoirs by comedians, because and they read them, right? Like Tina Fey, oh my gosh, who was the Trevor Noah?
Amy
They
Poehler.
read their own memoirs, and yeah, Amy Poehler. And I really love those because it really was like listening to their stand-up comedy or something like that, right? And I have to say, recently I stopped listening to a book and bought a printed copy, because the book is called Edible Economics, and it's by a Korean economist, and the book is about economics, about food around the world. And in the early chapter, in the first chapter, he uses so many Korean food names as in his talk about food, and the narrator just cannot say these words right.
No.
And I understand this is not obviously not someone who speaks Korean, but it was so annoying. I mean, it was so annoying. It was unforgivable. So I stopped listening, but I still wanted to
But
read the
it's
book.
kind of
I got
important.
myself a. No, I mean, and honestly,
It's kind of
I
important.
don't
Why
know.
can't they be somebody who speaks Korean? You mean to tell me there's no
That's what
bilingual
I said.
Koreans in this? That's
right.
false, because the two of us are sitting right here. But
no,
yeah.
That's exactly right. That's why I stopped listening to it, and then now I regret I used my one Audible, credit to download that book. But then I just bought the book myself.
I'll try to give you some. Well, I think
yes, it matters.
I think to your point, Kofi and Laura, a couple of things that you said. One is actors being good readers. And so for listeners who are looking to get, into audiobooks, I think Laura's recommendation of starting with comedians is a great one. It's very entertaining. But even there's like a blending of genres now. So I follow LeVar Burton's podcast, which is aptly titled LeVar Burton Reads, and it's literally just him reading a short story. And he selects the short story, he and his team, and he's got impeccable taste because, he is a reading rainbow person. Mm-hmm. And so I actually assigned that to my creative writing students along with the hard copy, because I know a lot of them are on the go and I want them to read it. And it doesn't matter what that man reads. He does such a good job.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if the narrative voice is female, male, a robot, an animal. He just does such a good job, reading it. So yeah, I mean, reading matters. And then my kids started listening to Storyline, I think is what it's called, with actors reading from their favorite children's stories. And it was so good that they still remember it. And kind of like you, Laura, I will try it out on audiobook. And if we really love it, I'll purchase it in the hard copy as well. But, some of the stories they still remember because, Alice and Janney or whoever read such a good, did such a good job.
Yeah. Yeah. Morgan Freeman does it for me too, even though his voice can be, it's such a familiar voice. It still works for whatever reason. And I can just listen to him and just probably go to sleep, but not because he's boring, but because of the sonorous nature of his voice. And it's in the way he uses his voice is just impressive. I do wonder if the voice is either too high or too low, if that affects how things go. And definitely if they're reading non-English words, I would imagine that can cause some consternation, especially if they're messing up on those words.
Any other sort of last?
Well, I was going to say, speaking of voices, I listened to Obama's memoir, the latest one, rather. And it's really long, right? And it's just hours and hours of Obama's voice in your ear. And it's really lovely. He reads really well. And actually, so does Michelle Obama too, her memoir too. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I really like memoirs in audiobook form, especially when the author reads it. Yeah.
It's like they're telling you their life story, They literally are. Yeah. They're telling you their life story.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but there are some people's voices I don't think I want to hear in an audio book. There's some...
Like who?
I don't want to say because it might get on the air and they might sue me. But I don't know why.
People who watch this show now.
Oh, that's just when they'll watch. I'm like, how dare him? I don't know. I don't think I could listen to a Jeff Foxworthy. It's not that I don't like Jeff Foxworthy. It's just I don't think I can sustain listening to his voice for an hour. if he's not doing stand-up, if he's just like kind of reading a memoir or something of his life. And,
That's true.
you know, he may have the Southern drawl and the charm, but he doesn't strike me as the person that can keep my attention just listening to his voice. Whereas some who do podcasts like Chelsea Handler, I probably could listen to her voice, even though it kind of can be a bit, I don't know what the right word is. I don't want to say annoying, but grating. Yeah. But I think she's funny, and I think she uses her voice to create that impression. Right. So yeah, maybe comedians are the better, maybe it goes comedians, actors, musicians, then authors. Because I imagine musicians can tell a good story too.
To be fair, I don't think I could do my own voice reading. I cannot sit through an audiobook with me myself. No. If I ever write a book and it has to be an audiobook, I will not be the person reading it. That's for sure.
I'll read your audiobook, Sylvia. Write it.
Thanks. I was hoping you would volunteer.
No, actually, I was going to say that I shared this before about how it's never occurred to me to download an audiobook of poetry. And when you go to, I tried it. I went to Audible and I just looked up poetry, and I can only really find that are poetry like classics, right? Like Penguin classics of like Longfellow or Wordsworth or something. But I don't see a whole lot of like contemporary poetry collections. I did find like a collection of Mary Oliver poetry, and she reads them, which I think is interesting. So I realized maybe that's not a widely sort of done thing which I don't know why that would be, because poets do readings in live events, right? But I thought that was interesting. Yeah, it's not as widely spread there. Yeah.
A lot of times you will find like people will access like poetry online, like YouTube, and even the audio online. And I think I ordered like for Christmas once, or someone got me a gift of like the CD set of all these poets reading their own poems. But, rarely, I agree. You don't really see a lot of poetry books with the authors. And I feel like in poetry, you have to have the author reading their own poem, even though one of the readings did attend, the poet reading their poem just kind of ruined the poem for me. And that was a very rare occasion. I think part of the reason for that is the economics behind audiobooks, right? Like these novels that take hours and hours and hours to record. Someone reading, they usually get into the sound booth, reserve the sound engineer, all the equipment, all of that to make a really decent recording. And I think it's tied around like the units of books that you're expected to move and, market. So I feel like part of that has to do with the fact that poetry is not as widely consumed as fiction, might be. And but the exception of some poets like Mary Oliver or some of these
Mary Oliver, right?
Yeah, like anthologized poets who have, now passed away before the whole advent of audiobooks became a thing. So I think that's part of the reason, but I'm wondering if maybe
that makes sense.
Yeah, we will see more of that maybe.
Stephen Colbert actually reads short stories very well, especially Flannery O'Connor's. He read one of her, I can't remember the name of it, but I liked it. And it made me want to reread that story again. So there is something about hearing other people's reading, especially if they do it well. You want to sort of go back to that text and see, if you can feel the same kind of energy that you're feeling when you're hearing that reader read. So at least that was for me. But I guess it's almost time for us to wind down. And and you could catch us on YouTube.
Dragon Digital Radio.podbean.com.
Exactly. That's exactly where you can catch us. Good, Sylvia. You answered the question. It was a test.
DragonDigitalRadio.podbean.com and on Bookish YouTube and our Bookish Facebook page. You can catch us in all those places.
You can catch us. Actually, I have to upload some stuff to our Facebook page.
Great.
Great.
There we go.
Thanks for
All
joining
right.
us.
It's been real.